Since joining the St. Louis Board of Aldermen nearly 10 years ago, 25th Ward Democrat Shane Cohn has championed a number of progressive issues, from increasing the minimum wage to reducing the penalties for marijuana possession. The number of more liberal aldermen has grown tremendously since Cohn was first elected, and that turnover means he's now among the top 10 aldermen in seniority. Cohn joins us on the latest edition of Politically Speaking to talk about how he and his fellow progressives can use their growing power to reshape St. Louis. Let's hit the music.
This is the Politically Speaking podcast, a candid conversation with the Show Me State's biggest political newsmakers.
I'm Jason Rosenbaum.
And I'm Joe Mannies.
Elections should be about your accomplishments. What have you done to qualify you for the position, and why are you qualified to run?
I'm going to push back on these regulators.
I'm doing this for the people.
I was encouraged along the way, not just by my family, but by a lot of teachers and professors, and knew when I was in college that I would run for office someday.
We're very excited about the prospect of having some more free market solutions.
Even though after the conversation, I still might not agree.
We want our listeners to get a real sense of what drives these people.
They're actually people with a story to tell.
And welcome to this edition of Politically Speaking. I'm St. Louis Public Radio's Rachel Lippmann, filling in as your host this week. And joining me in the studio today are
Joe Mannies.
And our special guest this week,
Shane Cohn.
And Shane, you are the alderman of the 25th Ward in St. Louis, right?
Correct.
Tell our listeners a little bit about the 25th Ward. Where is it located? What neighborhoods is it made up of? What are its characteristics?
Yeah, the 25th Ward is located in South Central Southeast City. It's home of the Dutchtown, Mount Pleasant, and Carondelet neighborhoods. I affectionately call it the South City Sweet Tooth because it also Dutchtown is home to Ted Drew's on Grand, Merb's Candies, and Dad's Cookies.
Oh, man.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up in Dutchtown.
You know, I grew up in the St. Louis area, primarily over in the Clayton area. Forest Park was my backyard as a kid, and I used to go over to the Loop when Blueberry Hill was pretty much the only thing in the Loop at the time, and also rode my bike downtown. I loved architecture. I loved history as a kid, and so I spent a lot of time in the art museum and the zoo and other wonderful attractions here in St. Louis. It was like my backyard, and so when I grew up, I consciously made a decision that I wanted to live in the city. And when I was looking around, I found Dutchtown, and it was a wonderful place full of history, beautiful architecture, and it's affordable. And I spent a few weeks meeting neighbors while I was down there before I decided to move into the neighborhood. And it's a wonderfully diverse community. Dutchtown actually has the highest concentration of immigrant populations in the entire region. Dutchtown itself is one of the most densely populated neighborhoods in the entire region as well. But it has its struggles, just like other neighborhoods and communities throughout the city and region do.
Doesn't Dutchtown have a mix? You have some Vietnamese, got Bosnians.
We have Bosnians, we have Vietnamese, Honduran, Mexican. We've actually had a lot of Afghani and Iraqi families that have been moving into the area as well.
No, I think it's fascinating because I've been watching especially the Bosnian population for years, as far as I keep predicting when they're going to have more political muscle because there's so many, and I personally know a number of them. But I know some have been moving out into South County, but it's just fascinating to watch because I think it's had such a huge impact on the city, more than many people may realize.
I agree. The Bosnian community is certainly woven into the rich history and tapestry of the city. And my ward has been the beneficiary of, some of their families settling in the neighborhood, particularly on the west side of Grand. And actually, Dutchtown is home to one of the best Bosnian restaurants in town. The Grbić family is called Dutchtown home for several years now. They were one of the first Bosnian families that settled in St. Louis, and as the refugee population was coming to town, were the family that was welcoming a lot of them into the community.
Has it been with all of the kind of debates over immigration? You've got the ruling in the travel ban case. Have you been hearing from some of those immigrant families with concerns about what's going on? How is that sort of impacting those who are already here?
Well, I think there's a lot of concern across all communities. And, we were just talking about the Bosnian community. this travel ban was largely viewed as a Muslim travel ban. Well, Bosnians are largely Bosnian Muslim. They're split between Catholic and Muslim, and a lot of the community that settled here was from the Muslim portion of Bosnia. And so I think that it really strikes at the heartstrings of a lot of folks that, who's next?
Because a number of the Bosnians who settled in St. Louis are Muslim, do you run into where they talk to you about either cases where they've been either discriminated against or there's been like conflict between different ethnic groups within the Muslim community?
Well, it's funny because, Dutchtown is a very diverse community. And typically when you have that, you have silos that operate. But, on my block alone, I have, folks that live or immigrated from Nigeria, who immigrated from Vietnam, who immigrated from Mexico or Honduras. And, we all share kind of the same values and vision and want, a better life for our families, our kids, our friends, our neighbors. In terms of conflict, there's always going to be conflict whenever you have, multicultural dynamics at play. We have a very large Vietnamese population, and they bought one of the closed public schools in the neighborhood and wanted to start a Buddhist congregation there. And so when they did that, they actually had to go do a patent petition process to open up their congregation, but they were going to have monks and nuns staying there as well, and kind of a convent, if you will. And so they had to get signatures from neighbors, and folks were just, what's going on here? Why are we allowing a boarding house? Because underneath city law, the patent petition is for a boarding house. And so as alderman, I had to go around, with my Vietnamese neighbors who were opening up a Buddhist monastery to, basically collect signatures and help people understand what is actually happening. And so, yes, sometimes there's, what could be perceived as conflict, but I think, a lot of it is just, helping people understand and work through the issues.
What got you into wanting to move from being a resident of the 25th Ward in Dutchtown to representing the 25th Ward in Dutchtown? Because you've been down at the Board of Aldermen now
since 2009.
Yeah. So 9 years now.
9 years.
One
it's
of the
hard
veterans.
to believe.
By now, yeah.
We've had quite a bit of turnover at the board, so I'm now considered a ranking alderman after 9 years, which is frightening for me. But I ran because my neighbors asked me to. Frankly, I really didn't have any designs to run for public office. I'm an openly gay man, and when I came out, it was in the late 1990s when things like the Defense of Marriage Act and Don't Ask, Don't Tell had just passed fairly recently in the arc of history. And so I really didn't think that an openly gay person had a place at the table. But I was very active, both in my neighborhood and the community at large. I was on the board of the Dutchtown South Community Development Corporation. I helped revitalize the Neighborhood Business Association with a group of my neighbors, and would do volunteer activities with neighborhood youth. And then outside of that, I was also involved with the Pride Festival board and promo and other LGBT-oriented organizations, and then also the National Conference for Community and Justice. I was on their board before getting elected as well. And so I've always had a passion for social justice because of my background, and that coupled with my involvement in my community, my neighbors, asked me to consider running for public office.
One of the more striking things to me, I remember in 2001, I worked for the Post-Dispatch then, and I was traveling with Francis Lay, who was then just running for mayor, and he went to some gay bars and was also going to stop by in the Pride Parade and stuff. Well, back then, in 2001, nobody did that. And now Clarence Harmon, who was mayor at the time, had stopped by the Pride Parade like a year or two earlier, but that had been like an earthquake, a political earthquake in St. Louis when politicians started openly stopping by either LGBT, parades, bars, restaurants, whatever, because it just wasn't done before.
It wasn't at all.
No one even talked about it. I mean, when I covered the Board of Aldermen back in the late 70s, nobody talked about this stuff.
I have friends that, in the LGBT community that, were arrested for either being in a gay bar or, being a drag queen and a female impersonator. And so those people are alive today and still share their history and memories with younger folks in the community. And it just, like I said, when I came out, didn't think that was going to be a place for me at the table. And so, I actually, when my neighbors approached me about running, brought that up, and I asked them to talk to some of their neighbors and, put feelers out there just to see, if folks would be okay with that. And, overwhelmingly, folks in my community came back saying, yeah, he sounds like a good guy. Let's, get behind him.
Did that surprise you in any way, like how little of an issue it was in the campaign? Because I can't remember in any of the campaigns it even really being discussed. It's just like, oh, it's Shane. He's running. He's, done a good job for us.
Yeah, it does come up, believe it or not. It might not hit the media, and maybe that's my fault because I don't want to broadcast bigotry out there. But during my first campaign, I did have opponents that were going into particularly minority-owned and immigrant-owned businesses that had my signs up in their windows and saying, why are you supporting Shane? Shane's gay. And of course, they would call me and they're like, hey, did you hear this person going around talking, smack about you? We told them get out of our our store. Shane's our guy, kind of a thing. So, it did happen. People were trying to play into that. And I actually remember after the election, my first election, Jim Merkel, who worked for the Suburban Journals at the time, asked me if me being gay played, a role in me getting, elected. And I'm like, you know what? Frankly, probably just as many people voted against me because I'm gay as people who voted for me because I'm gay. At the end of the day, I ran on a platform that was based on neighborhood development, youth engagement, and public safety and neighborhood safety. And I think that, the platform, my agenda, if you will, really resonated more with my neighbors than, my personal identity.
Now, remind me, did you come in challenging an incumbent, or were you an open seat race?
It was an open seat, but it was a four-way primary in my first election.
And it's been, I don't even think you had a challenger in your last
The last
primary.
two election cycles, I ran unopposed.
And is that, it's got to be heartening that nobody thinks they can unseat you, but at the same time, is it disheartening that people aren't engaged enough to do it, or how do you react to not having challengers?
It's funny because I actually get asked that fairly regularly, and even though I don't have a challenger, I don't stop campaigning. I don't take an election for granted. Before filing even opens, I'm usually calling a few hundred neighbors of mine, asking them, to do lunch or have a dinner with me or have a conversation, and I ask them, what's on their minds and if they're going to, support me for re-election. I'm not going to waste people's time by running for re-election if I don't have the support from people in my neighborhood, And so, and I try and put feelers out to see if they've heard of anyone that, might be considering running against me. I'm open to having that conversation, and I frankly would welcome someone, to challenge me. It might be fun, but, at the
careful
end
what you wish for.
You never know in these trying times. But at the end of the day, I still campaign, and it was funny because I believe it was my last re-election where I ran unopposed. My colleague from the 11th Ward, who was up for re-election at the same time, Tom Villa, so it was actually 2 elections ago, he came up to me and he's like, who's running against you, Shane? And Tom Villa, for those of you that don't know, the
He's
Villa family is a legend and kind of a storied family in St. Louis. But
Villa Lighting.
Villa Lighting. Yeah. There's a
Red Villa.
Villa.
His dad. He used to run this amazing bar in South St. Louis when I first went to the board. He'd already been on the board like 30 or 40 years when I started covering back in the late 70s.
The chambers of the Board of Aldermen are named after Red Villa. And so Tom, longtime member of the General Assembly, and now an alderman and former president of the Board of Aldermen, came up and asked me who's running against me. And I was like, Tom, I'm running unopposed. And he's like, yeah, but you have more yard signs up in your ward than I have in mine, and I have opposition. So I just don't take an election for granted. I don't think that that's fair to my constituency. And frankly, it's not fair to me. I need to know what's going on in my neighborhood and going on with my neighbors.
So what are some of the things that are going on in the neighborhood that you're trying to use your position at the Board of Aldermen to help? I know you mentioned development is a big one. You've got Cleveland High School in your neighborhood, an old SLPS building. What are some of the other things you're trying to work on?
I would say the issues that I'm working on are very much the issues that I campaigned on still. Neighborhood safety is still paramount in my ward. We have a large challenge. Grand runs right through the middle of my ward, and there's large vacancy rates, particularly on the northern part of Grand, that tend to lend themselves to other types of criminal activity. So that's still a challenge. But the Neighborhood Business Association and myself have been working the last several years at addressing some of those things. We recently just put up cameras on South Grand, but also the neighbors and myself worked to get the Community Improvement District established. And so we have a large portion of the neighborhood, particularly along Grand, Merrimack, and Virginia, that are now basically taxing themselves to help pay for some of the improvements, both physical and also on the, if you will, safety side of things. And then also we still have 30% of my ward is underneath the age of 18. So, that's a huge population that, needs support and needs resources. And so bringing resources to the table, Jean Slate Boys and Girls Club is moving into the neighborhood. They're keeping their location in Soulard, but they're opening up a second satellite in the Dutchtown neighborhood. And development is always important. We still struggle with about a 20% vacancy rate in the neighborhood. So, we're working on addressing those issues too.
Now, I remember hearing that some of the families that were in what was then McReetown is now Botanical Heights ended up sort of in the 20th and the 25th Ward. Is that how you get a lot of sort of the younger population in there, or?
The young population comes from everywhere. I have young families that are moving into the neighborhood, and a large part of that is the affordability. It's very difficult to make ends meet as, a young family in today's world. So I think being able to own your own home, or, the rents are still fairly stable down in my neck of the woods. So they're able to have access to things like, wonderful restaurants and, the interstate to get to their jobs. So they're able to have all of those amenities but still have the affordability. So I think it's a practical thing for many of the families, whether they're white or black or immigrant.
Now, one of the things you mentioned were the cameras. And I was just recently talking to Governor Mike Parson, who there's been an issue arisen because the DOT apparently has come out against the cameras in the city. Parson says he's going to try to change it.
It's the license plate readers that were installed on on state poles, I think was sort of the deal.
Right. But still, it's kind of related to the broader, debate over cameras, even though that's just the license plate readers. But there's also the broader issue. I'm just interested in what you're hearing from your residents. 20 years ago, I think there was somewhat of a resistance. Now it seems like a lot of aldermen are often asking to have cameras on certain corners that maybe where there's believed to be a lot of crime activity. I'm just interested in what you're hearing in your area, especially because I used to live there 40 years ago.
Oh, did you really?
And just kind of what...
So, with cameras, I am not a huge fan of having, cameras everywhere. I have my concerns around, privacy and everything else, just like any other, American does. So I'm not one that would rush into putting those up. But I did have, particularly along Grand, because of the level of prostitution and drug dealing that has happened over the years there, you have to balance these things out. And so, when I have neighbors that are sending me emails or text messages about, a transaction happening in the alleyway behind their house and, genitalia is being exposed when their kids are trying to play in the backyard, that's not fair to my neighbors and to my residents. And, the police are certainly part of the bigger picture there. So our education system and jobs and mental health and everything else. We need to take a more comprehensive approach to these things. But in the meanwhile, I think having a targeted approach in certain areas is, reasonable. I don't think putting cameras up at every intersection in the city is the answer. I was very much adamantly opposed to red light cameras. I'm still, very hesitant of cameras in many cases. And actually, when we were debating police body cameras, while I agree that, that is an appropriate measure to address some of the equity issues that we have in our region and whatnot, one of the examples that I brought up is, one, domestic disturbances. Do we want those things, caught on camera, victims being caught on camera? And, in my own personal case, every once in a while, I like to sleep with my, front door or back door open. I've got wonderful neighbors. They call the police because they're concerned that my front door is open. And I believe it was maybe last year I had police show up at my front door at 6 a.m. in the morning, and it was a beautiful spring morning. Well, I was in my underwear. I didn't want that caught on camera. So I think, if we're going to have the debate around, cameras, I think the important part of that debate is how do we control data, who has access to it, the security around it, and how do we still maintain citizens' privacy and making sure that, the data is still locally contained and, not generally accessible to, the public or, other LEO agencies.
Now, how do you and how do people in your ward, how do they relate to the mayor and the administration right now? Because obviously it's different than it was, just 18 months ago.
That's a great question. I think that the administration is in a place where it's still finding itself. And actually the mayor just hired a new chief of staff, so we'll see how that shakes
Someone
things up.
Someone you know very well, actually, a former alderman.
A former alderman, Steve Conway, the former alderman of the 8th Ward, the Shaw neighborhood. So, working relationship-wise, I've always had a, decent working relationship with Steve Conway. I've had a, working relationship with, Lyda. So, I would hope that
who was
those
also a former alderwoman
of the 28th Ward, the Central West End. And so, I would hope that those relationships would bear fruit for my, constituents. I think on the policy, level, there's always going to be disagreements. So, certainly there's, going to be issues in that front. But I think if the administration is able to, kind of get its bearings and start to, move forward with both policies and, development and other things that would benefit my community, my neighbors are very supportive of that.
Were you hoping the fact that she was an alderwoman would kind of help her reach out to the board and sort of really work with her on policies that she wanted that may overlap with what other alder people wanted? I mean, how is that? Has it borne as much fruit as you thought it might?
The same time she got elected, we had roughly a third of the board flip over as well. And so I don't know if her being an alder person is going to help her in that regard when you have a third of the body that's changed, hands.
At least.
And so, and that's just in the last election cycle. If you count the last 2 election cycles, it's almost half of the board is new, which is how, myself in my third term, I think I'm now number 8 out of, 29 total down at the Board of Aldermen. And so if you include the president's office. And so I think that, yes, that she has been a very hands-on mayor in terms of, kind of the aldermanic issues. So if it's something like a nuisance property or, forestry or trash, that's something that very much resonates with her. And I've had residents that have called her and she calls them back directly. That's a wonderful thing. And actually during her campaign, she put her cell phone on all of her signage, which I thought was very compelling, and kind of wondering if I know she still has the same phone number. I was going to make a joke about that. But, I think at the end of the day, we do have a lot of issues facing the city that need some serious attention. And, we have residents and, mine included, that want to make sure that city services are being delivered equitably and that they're being delivered, frankly. I've twice now voted against increasing trash fees in the city of St. Louis. And, yet I still have to pay those fees just like anyone else and all of my residents. But, if you knock doors in my ward, people are upset about trash too. Just because we have a diverse and, community and that, we also have a lot of issues, it doesn't mean that we don't want our fair share of city services.
Does the budget that will take effect July 1st, does it meet the needs of the city, the spending plan? It's like a $1.1 billion spending plan.
I am not currently a fan of the budget. I'll be honest. I think that we could do a better job as a city of delivering services equitably and fairly across the board. And I don't think that the current budget reflects that, honestly. And so, the budget has to be passed by the Board of Aldermen. Otherwise, the budget that was proposed by the Board of Estimate and Apportionment is the budget that gets, approved. So, the Board of Aldermen has very little leverage in the, budget deliberation process. If we're really only able to do line item vetoes and make suggestions back to ENA in terms of where we want the money added back into the budget, but if we don't pass our version of the budget, then ENA's budget goes into effect. So, that's actually something that myself and some of my colleagues are looking at doing, is bringing that back, the budget process, the beginning of the budget process, back to the Board of Aldermen. That's how it's done at the state and federal level. It starts with the legislative body. Of course, there's input from the executive branch and the various departments, but the legislative body is the body that really works through the budget planning process. And right now, even though people say that we have a weak mayoral system, the Board of ENA, Estimate and Apportionment, is a very powerful board in the city of St. Louis, and really has a huge amount of power when it comes to budgetary decisions. The budget does not reflect what I feel would be the important things that we need to address as a city. Are there fixes in there that I think are amenable to myself and my constituents? Sure. Is it a little bit better than what ENA put out there? Yes. But I think we can do better for sure.
Yeah, I mean, this is just for historical perspective for our listeners. ENA is the mayor, the president of the Board of Aldermen, and the comptroller. And frankly, any major financial decision, they have to okay it first. And they also weigh in on some related issues. So pretty much the city of St. Louis is actually ruled by a triumvirate. And they're kind of like the Bigfoot. And so it's not just the mayor. I think some people misunderstand how much power the mayor in St. Louis does not have. It has more than it used to have for various reasons, but does not have as much clout as, let's say, some mayors in some cities where they don't have this approach. But on the other hand, it does mean that there's more discussion and there's more communities involved in making these decisions.
To some extent.
If they're familiar with how government works, then sure.
They know where to put the leverage.
If they know where to put the leverage, exactly. And I think that becomes part of the challenge as well. The mayor's office, regardless of who's sitting in that chair, ultimately has a lot of accountability that's put on them. And frankly, St. Louis doesn't have just a system of checks and balances. We have a system of checks and balances with a system of checks and balances. And so, I think that causes a lot of confusion. And then you throw in on top of it all of the different Band-Aids that have been created over the years, whether it's MSD or the Zoo Museum District or, any number of, special taxing districts and whatnot that have, come to the table. And it becomes a very convoluted, process and structure to understand.
Now, this is something I've wondered about. Do people, let's say, in your ward or many of the city wards that when you're dealing with the Board of Aldermen, do they discuss much about the whole question of, let's say, the city re-entering the county or stuff like that? That's kind of an obsession in the county. But I've always I'm not sure it's as big an issue among average people in the city. I mean, what do you hear from your constituents?
Well, as someone who still has friends and family out in the county, I realize that conversation in the county is often used as a wedge issue out in the county, which is probably why it's discussed more by the kind of political establishment out there, because it's a way for them to rally a base and maybe turn out some votes. And the city, I think that people, want to take a pragmatic and reasonable approach. You're going to still have people in the city that don't want to be part of the county. They think that, this is the, best system of government that we still have available to us. And then there are those of us that think that, this region is broken. I'm one of them. St. Louis was designed, as it's currently designed, was designed to keep people out, literally. The county has, 88 municipalities now. I think we just dissolved one in the last election. So that's 2 in the last, 9 years that I've been down at the Board of Aldermen. And so, if you think about it, I mean, and literally most of those municipalities out in the county were designed literally to keep people out. So I just, when you think of that as the basis for why we're structured the way we are, I don't think that that's a functioning form of government, going forward. And, so I think that, there's a lot of redundancy. There's certainly a lot of expenses that, are unnecessary, if we had a more consolidated government structure in the region. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's up to the voters to decide, how that plays out. Do those conversations happen in kitchens and living rooms in the 25th Ward? Absolutely. Generally it's more topical, when it comes up, but we're not using it as a wedge issue. We're using it more as a, what's right for the region conversation.
I want to get back to, you were talking about you're now 9th or 8th in seniority out of the 29 members of the Board of Aldermen. And you are kind of, I don't know if you would use this term, I'd use it as one of like the OGs of sort of a more like progressive wing of the Democratic Party that got up to the board. And I'm wondering kind of how the dynamics have changed over those 9 years and what you think is possible now with a lot of the turnover at the board.
Yeah, that's a great question. I won my election the same time that Antonio French won his, and Casey Star Triplett was down there already for about a year or two when I was sworn in. And then, over time, we've had folks like Scott Ogilvie from the 24th Ward and Christine Ingracia and others who have, joined. And certainly in this last two rounds of elections, we've seen a larger progressive faction come down to the board. I think we do our best to use the energy that is being brought by the new people to the board and the wisdom of the OGs, if you will. I'll be honest, it can be exhausting, working as an alderman. I very often will work a 10 or 12 hour day, and so it's a lot to corral 28 people as well. And so I think that, when you're working towards policy issues, we need to not only work on those policy issues, but the relationships that need to come along with them to effectively pass legislation. And so, I've been down there for, I'm going into my 10th year, and I've worked on, drug reform. I've worked on, minimum wage was a huge battle.
I forgot you carried that.
Yeah. And so there's a whole lot of issues that need to be talked about and worked on in the city. Right now we're discussing the airport privatization. How does that work and what does that look like, for a progressive St. Louis and a fair and equitable St. Louis, frankly. So right now we're discussing legislation to bring that to a vote of the people, if it comes down to that. What does that look like? One of the things that I brought up with some of my colleagues when we went through the deliberations over Forest Park with BJC, wanting to long-term lease or purchase part of Forest Park, what was that, 10, 15 years ago, there was the same push to make sure that there was a public vote on any, sale or lease of parklands. And so now, we did that, and I fully support that in concept, right? But when it comes down to the practicality of it, a lot of folks don't know Michigan and Hill Street or Minnesota and Hill Street Park, which if you've ever been to Minnesota Hill Street Park, it's literally a vacant piece of land. There's no sidewalks, no roads, no signage, no playground. It's literally just a big vacant piece of land. But if we're ever going to do anything productive or constructive with it, it has to go to a vote of the people of the city of St. Louis. How many people in the Central West End even know where Minnesota and Hill Street are? It's just we have to be careful and judicious in how we craft legislation in terms of making sure that these go out to the vote of the people. Is it every city asset that does that, or is it just the airport? Is it a sale or is it a lease? There's all sorts of language that needs to be crafted and done so deliberately so we don't end up with unintended consequences.
Well, now, of course, there's the whole issue of the board becoming smaller. How does that play out? How does it affect veterans like yourself? Might they end up going back to the voters, telling them, never mind? I'm just interested in what your thoughts are and what you're hearing regarding the board reduction plan. And one of the reasons I bring this up for your ward is because I am so old that I covered the Board of Aldermen when they moved the 25th Ward from the Central West End down south, because David Pentland, who was the alderman at the time, had shock propose reducing the size of the Board of Aldermen?
The current alderman of the 25th Ward is carrying on the tradition of the former alderman of the 25th Ward. I fully supported the reduction of the Board of Aldermen. I was one of the co-sponsors of the bill. My ward overwhelmingly voted in favor of reduction of the Board of Aldermen. So to this day, even though there's a board bill to put a motion to reconsider out on the ballot, I feel as though when you have a huge turnout, I believe the turnout for the election where this was decided was 70% or higher. And then on top of that, it's an overwhelming majority of the city that voted in favor of it. I think we need to allow time for the change to take place before we reconsider whether or not it should. The voters voice their concerns and their place in the matter, and I think that we need to honor that.
Do you at least understand the concerns that the ones who support reversing ward reduction have? The idea that it could serve to lessen African-American representation, elected African-American representation in the city, which is why a lot of the African-American representatives in North County are against a lot of the municipal reform because they think it would reduce African-American elected power.
The St. Louis American actually did a really wonderful piece on, is it black representation or black power? And I think if you look at the way, and the conversation got cut off. There was no debate on this board bill, which I think is one of the reasons why it's not going to pass out. Frankly, is because the sponsor and some of the co-sponsors of the bill literally cut off any debate. So we couldn't have this conversation that you and I are having right now. We couldn't have that amongst colleagues on the floor of the Board of Aldermen. And so, one of the things that I was going to bring up in that debate was if you look at the state house districts for the city of St. Louis, there's 10 state house districts that touch the city of St. Louis, 10. We're looking at cutting the board to 14. Out of those 10, 6 are held by African Americans. So, there's fewer districts and greater representation. So I think in some respects they're saying, let's trust the voters, but oh, by the way, let's put it back out to the voters. When in fact, if you look at, the citywide elections, we have roughly, I think it's 8 citywide office holders. Only 3 of them are white. So citywide office holders, overwhelmingly African American. The state rep districts, 6 out of 10 are represented by, African Americans. And so I think when, it comes down to it, we need to look at how we're drawing the map versus whether or not we should have 14 or 28.
Your name gets tossed around a lot for potential citywide offices, mayor, board of aldermen, president. Have you ever considered running for a bigger office than the 25th Ward alderman?
Have I considered it? Absolutely. Politics is a fickle friend, and so, whether or not those come into fruition is another topic for probably another day.
Do you get a lot of encouragement? Are there certain, because you've been on the board for so long, are there certain skills that you think you might bring to a citywide office?
I get asked regularly if I'm going to run for higher office. And I'm very much flattered and honored by that. And frankly, every time the 81st district comes up for re-election, I get asked, the state rep district that I live in, I always get asked by various, neighbors and groups whether or not I'm going to, run for state rep. As a openly gay urban Democrat, Jefferson City and the House of Representatives is not exactly where I want to spend my time because I don't feel like I can be as effective down there, So I feel like, if the opportunity and time presents itself, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in my neighborhood. And I really, I didn't run for public office to move up into, a greater political sphere. I ran for public office to represent my neighbors and to, work in their better interest. And so that's where things are with me right now. And if I view, the next step, whether that's, a state office or, a higher local office, that's something that I need to evaluate at that point in time.
Well, if you do change your mind or get asked, we'll have you back on the show. For all of our episodes of Politically Speaking, you can go to our website, stlpublicradio.org. You can get me on Twitter at @rlippmann. That's RLIPPMANN. Follow Joe at
J Mannies. That's JMANNIES.
And Shane?
at Shane Cohn, ShaneCohn.
And that's all for this episode of Politically Speaking. So long.